Bonjour, je m'appelle Tim Leonard, je suis gestionnaire des services au Autochtone Canada. Je suis responsable pour les informations socio-démographiques sur les Premières Nations, les Inuits et les Métis. Il me fait plaisir de souhaiter la bienvenue à tous nos participants canadiens et internationaux. Nous sommes très heureux que vous voyez de notre pour cette conférence virtuelle de RCCDR, présentée en partenariat avec Statistique Canada. This week's series addresses cross-cutting research and policy priorities, and today the spotlight is on Indigenous issues. I'm very pleased to welcome 4 panelists who will discuss the role of the CRDCN and that of First Nations Information Government Center in enabling research and policy-related analysis in the pursuit of a just, equitable, and inclusive Canada. They will also share their aspirations for future data, research, and policy development. Each of our 4 panelists has 6 to 7 minutes to do their presentation, and as this part of the panel is already pre-recorded, we invite you to submit your questions as you listen to each speaker. We will get to them as many as possible in the live Q&A. It is now my pleasure to invite Donna Fier, an assistant professor of economics at the University of Victoria, to kick off today's panel. Donna is an applied labor economist and economic historian who has published on reconciliation, modern Indigenous labor market experiences, health, and the impact of historic policies on Indigenous economies and people. She is also a research fellow at the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis and the ISA Institute of Labor Economics. Welcome, Donna.
So I wanted to talk very briefly about my experience as a researcher and seeing how important data has been for policy development, both in Canada and briefly in the US. So I first wanted to make the point that data really matters because it can drive agendas at a federal and local level. So, for example, in 2015, the Assembly of First Nations really drove home this Close the Gap initiative and policy framework that was adopted by the eventual government. And this agenda was really driven by a lot of the work that this RDCs and the data within them allowed to occur. So looking at differences between Indigenous populations and the Canadian public in general, it becomes very clear that there was obvious economic marginalization. There's been a political push toward closing this. In my time in the United States, I also found how policymakers at the Federal Reserve really value data, and community members and First Nations in the US needed data in order to make their cases toward federal governments, state governments, and local governments. Now, many economists have leveraged data available through Canada's research data centers in order to make really important policy discoveries so we can advance conversations about increasing social and economic equity. So I wanted to go through 2 examples. The first is work by Fernando Aragon. He's an economist at SFU. And what he did is he studied the impact of adoption of modern treaties for First Nations communities in Canada. And his work had really powerful findings. So what this figure shows is a number of years before and after the adoption of a modern treaty and its implementation, in combination with a comprehensive land claim and a settlement. And what he essentially showed is after a modern treaty was settled for First Nations, you found an increase in real income of First Nations people within their communities of up to 30%, which is huge. So clarifying jurisdiction and property rights for First Nations in Canada is a critical policy issue toward economic reconciliation. And this was demonstrated using data from Canada's research data centers, and it can be displayed really. It's also very high respected work by economists. It's very clean and thorough and important policy evidence for the future. Another example I wanted to give about how Canada's research data centers has supported research that has really important policy relevance is work by Maggie Jones, who's currently at the University of Victoria. So what this shows and what she studied was the effective cutbacks to post-secondary funding for First Nations in Canada. And basically what this image is showing you is since the cutbacks, that red line in the center is the date just before the cutbacks started to occur, is you see that there is actually a decline in First Nations high school graduation rates after there was these effective cutbacks to post-secondary funding for First Nations students. So what she postulates in the paper is that if you don't have the opportunity to go to post-secondary, this also might discourage high school graduation and increase the difference in educational attainment between Indigenous and non-Indigenous populations in Canada. This is really important policy implications as well for closing the gap, which is one of these major initiatives. Now, I wanted to discuss a few items about moving forward. So the RDC's data has already contributed to really important work. It's policy relevant. I've discussed a few of my colleagues here. I have work of my own I'd be happy to share and discuss with you if you're interested. But I think a few of the questions that I would like to see addressed in the future is first to really leverage RDC data to address questions at the level of the First Nation, or the Métis Nation, et cetera, or Indigenous nations generally. And I think it's important to address questions at the level of the nation rather than that of the individual sometimes, so we can think about First Nations as having this government-to-government relationship, implementing policies, et cetera. And it also will allow us to get away from the deficit framework that's really framed a lot of economic research to date. I also think it's extremely important for the RDCs as we move forward to collaborate deeply with the First Nations Information Governance Center in order to increase community access to their data. Remote access for this is critical. I saw working in the United States closely with Indigenous communities and communities here how critical data was and how limited access could be for some communities. So really advancing access is extremely important in the future, I think, for the research data centers. I also think that Canada has a great opportunity to leverage existing data to centralize Indigenous priorities. So while, of course, no country is perfect, they can always do data better on a data front, Canada with the First Nation, with the Aboriginal Peoples surveys, has a whole set of data, and some of the data sets that are available through the First Nation Information Governance Center have information that simply isn't existing in other countries. For example, on traditional activities, actual values of individuals themselves living in within Indigenous communities, and to really leverage this data beyond what it's been used for so far is extremely important. To the extent the RDCs can support knowledge mobilization with research, so it's actionable and accountable to community members, I think is essential. So research can really hit the ground. And finally, I think it'd be extremely useful, at least from the perspective of economists, if we could develop and increase longitudinal data for analysis, which is pretty sparse in the Indigenous context, and also to increase data available on economic development, such as on businesses over the long run. Thank you.
It's for me, the importance of data and how to make data actionable is so important to policy, and thank you for bringing that and highlighting a couple of those success stories. Maintenant, il fait me plaisir d'inviter Madame Simona Bignami, professeure agrégée au département de démographie de l'Université de Montréal. À vous adresser la parole, Madame Bignami est directrice du groupe d'études sur la démographie autochtone qui réunit le personnel et les étudiants qui s'intéressent à la dynamique des populations autochtones à l'Université de Montréal, à l'Université de McGill et au ministère des Relations couronnes autochtones et des Affaires du Nord du Canada. Simona, à vous la parole.
Bonjour, merci beaucoup pour l'invitation à cette panel très intéressant sur les questions autochtones. So thank you for inviting me to this very interesting panel that makes a spotlight on Indigenous issue. What I would like to talk about is to give my perspective as a demographer about what do the data that are hosted in the research data centers of Statistics Canada actually tell us about Indigenous communities and what are the opportunities that we should seize in the future to improve our knowledge about Indigenous communities. I am going to share with you a few slides. So demographers determine the characteristics and evolution of a given population through a combination of data sources. In order to understand what do we know about Indigenous communities, I thus would like to give you a very brief review about the data sources that are used in Canada to gain this knowledge. Data sources which, as I said, are hosted through the RDC. So first, we calculate the size of the Indigenous population from census data by exploiting answers to questions that individuals are asked about whether they identify with a specific Indigenous group or with a specific Indian band. And then we determine population growth by assessing changes in answers to these questions between one census year and the other. The composing population growth that we measured this way into its components of mortality, fertility, and migration would normally be done using vital registration data. However, in Canada, this cannot be done because vital registration data does not contain Indigenous identifiers. The Indian Registry, which is maintained by Indigenous Services, is limited to First Nations and has a number of issues related to delays in reporting that make it less useful even for these subgroups. So mortality, fertility, and migration for Indigenous peoples are estimated through ad hoc models that use census available vital registration data and more recently administrative data. As for studies that look at individual and community determinants of demographic behaviors and outcomes, the main available data source at the moment is the Aboriginal People Survey, which is a post-census survey generally carried out a year after each census, and which collect cross-sectional data from individuals that in the census have identified themselves as Indigenous. However, the APS is limited only to off-reserve population, not from First Nation living on reserve. Our knowledge of Indigenous peoples' demographics is not just limited by the fact that all answers come from just two data sources. So what I would like to highlight is that there is a larger problem, which arises from the fact that the two companion data sources, the census and the Aboriginal People Surveys, in fact, adopt demographic concepts and measures that are the same for Indigenous peoples and non-Indigenous Canadian. And I'm going to give you an example that really speaks to the main theme of this panel, which is, what if we were to ask how many Indigenous communities are there in Canada? Well, the answer, in fact, depends on their legal status in Canada and how that legal status translates into census concepts. So for First Nation communities, which have a specific legal status in Canada, that legal status translates into the fact that the census enumerates most of them, at least, as census subdivisions, or CSDs as they are known. But already Inuit communities, which have a different legal status, are actually reflected in census data differently. And Métis communities, which have no legal status in Canada, are in fact not measured directly through census data. And this has important implication for associated indicators to community level demographics, notably the Community Wellbeing Index that Indigenous Service Canada calculates regularly using census data. So this is to say that in the two main available data sources on Indigenous demography, the point of reference are non-Indigenous Canadians. And available data are used to highlight differences between Indigenous people and, in quote, the general population. So what is our opportunity here? Our opportunity is to improve statistical representation of Indigenous peoples in Canada's data sources. So on the one hand, we can do so by improving the data themselves, by collecting cross-sectional longitudinal demographic surveys with samples large enough to allow us for analysis of all Indigenous groups on and off reserve. We can achieve this goal by improving data dissemination. For example, the 2016 final census report for the first time tabulated living arrangement of Indigenous households according to characteristics that were different than for non-Indigenous households. And so started giving us a little glimpse into actually the heterogeneity of Indigenous household living arrangements. And lastly, we can improve our definition, our analytical methods. And this is what I try to do in my current research precisely on Indigenous family structures by applying a new methodology to capture the variability and the heterogeneity of indigenous living arrangements without drawing from Western-based classifications of the nuclear family. So to conclude with a quote that I think captures well the point where we are and the opportunities lying forward, in science, great difficulties sometimes experience in giving up hypothesized structures. So we cannot let, in the true spirit of reconciliation, to let this structure constrain our knowledge and our understanding of indigenous demography. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simona, for your words talking about two very important data sources, the census and the Aboriginal People Survey. We very much need to use these data sources better and come across some consensus on the definitions of Indigenous communities, absolutely, and work towards filling the data gaps by increasing our sample sizes. So thank you very much for your advice on that. Notre prochain conférencier est Monsieur Gérard Duhaime, professeur à l'Université Laval. Monsieur Duhaime est à la fois visionnaire et innovateur et ses efforts pour trouver des moyens d'améliorer la vie des collectivités nordiques ont fait de lui l'un des principaux chercheurs au monde en sciences sociales. Son travail de description, d'analyse et de compréhension des conditions de vie dans le Nord a changé la façon de mener les recherches socio-économiques dans le Nord. Gérard, à vous la parole.
Merci beaucoup. La chaire de recherche du Canada sur la condition autochtone comparée est née à peu près en même temps que le réseau canadien des centres de données de recherche. Et la création de ce réseau a été le cadeau de naissance de la chaire de recherche. Grâce à la présence du centre sur le campus de l'Université Laval, mais aussi sur les autres campus avec lesquels nous avons travaillé, notamment à l'Université de Montréal, à la présence en particulier du Centre interuniversitaire québécois de statistique sociale, que nous appelons affectueusement le CIX, et à la collaboration durant toute cette période de Statistique Canada, parfois très étroite. Nous avons pu mener un programme de recherche qui, avec les moyens que nous avions, aurait été impossible autrement. Et je voudrais donner 3 exemples de cela. Le premier exemple couvre à peu près la décennie 2000 à 2010, où nous avons entrepris un programme d'études sur les conditions de vie dans l'Arctique canadien. Il s'agissait d'un projet qui s'est déroulé au Canada, mais aussi dans 5 autres pays de l'ère circumpolaire. Et au Canada, nous avons sollicité Statistique Canada pour participer à cette discussion et former un comité directeur avec la complicité des 4 grandes organisations régionales inuit du Nord canadien. Avec ce comité, nous avons créé le supplément arctique à l'enquête sur les peuples autochtones qui a été donc utilisé pour l'enquête de 2001 et de 2006. Et ce questionnaire a servi de modèle pour la même enquête en Alaska, au Groenland, dans les pays scandinaves et dans quelques régions de la Russie. Dans des publications, plusieurs articles dans des revues scientifiques internationales, des mémoires et des thèses, nous avons pu montrer, grâce à cette enquête, l'existence de la stratification économique dans la région inuit du Canada et des importantes inégalités systémiques entre les Autochtones et les non-autochtones qui y résident. Nous avons pu montrer aussi, par les mêmes moyens, les relations entre les conditions matérielles, les conditions objectives d'existence et les conditions symboliques ou subjectives. Dans ce questionnaire, en effet, on avait intégré des questions qui nous ont permis de comprendre l'attachement des communautés à leur terre, malgré les conditions matérielles difficiles. Et ces enquêtes, ici au Canada, mais aussi ailleurs, Ces nouvelles connaissances qui ont été produites ont permis d'éclairer avec une nouvelle lumière le débat sur les velléités de relocalisation ou de concentration de la population dans les centres plus importants. Velléités qui, au Canada comme ailleurs, avaient des résonances très négatives. Un autre exemple, celui de la mesure de la pauvreté, ce programme de recherche a commencé dans les années 2000 et est encore en cours aujourd'hui. À travers des articles, nous avons pu mesurer d'abord la pauvreté dans la région inuit en appliquant des mesures usuelles, mais en ajoutant une information qui n'est jamais apparue dans les mesures usuelles, c'est-à-dire l'importance du coût de la vie dans le Grand Nord. Et en refaisant ces calculs pour l'ensemble du territoire inuit, nous avons pu montrer que le taux de pauvreté dans ces régions est 3 à 4 fois supérieur au taux de pauvreté dans l'ensemble de la population. Les impacts de ces données, de ces résultats, ont conduit dans certaines régions à l'adoption d'importants programmes pour réduire le coût de la vie, soit par des crédits d'impôt ou des subventions au prix, qui venaient s'ajouter au programme Nutrition Nord. Le troisième et dernier exemple est celui qui porte sur la lutte à la pauvreté dans les Premières Nations du Canada. Comme nous l'avions fait avec les organisations inuites à partir de 2010, l'Assemblée des Premières Nations du Canada nous a demandé à 5 universités canadiennes et 5 communautés des mêmes provinces de participer à un projet pilote dans lequel nous essaierions de comprendre la perspective des Premières Nations sur la pauvreté et la perspective des Premières Nations sur les modalités, sur les moyens pour lutter contre la pauvreté. Ces travaux ont permis, et leur diffusion et leur analyse à proximité, nous ont permis de mesurer les inégalités dans les conditions économiques et sociales des communautés participantes par rapport aux communautés voisines non autochtones. Et elles nous ont permis aussi de documenter la perspective autochtone de la pauvreté qui est fort éloignée de ce qu'on trouve dans nos livres de sociologie. Et finalement de mesurer, d'étudier le taux de pauvreté sur une période de 20 ans en revenant en arrière avec les recensements pour lesquels les données étaient suffisamment valides et nombreuses. Dans des rapports et des articles, nous avons aussi, dans des rapports, nous avons donc mesuré ces phénomènes. Et dans un rapport à paraître sous peu, nous allons publier les résultats, notamment sur le taux de pauvreté en fonction du type de traité qu'ont signé les Premières Nations ou du fait qu'il n'y avait pas de traité qui avait été signé. Pour le futur, ce que je souhaite, c'est que d'abord, il est clair que sans la proximité de ce réseau, de ces centres de données, ces recherches n'auraient pas pu être réalisées avec les moyens qu'on a, avec cette échelle d'études. Et ce que je souhaite pour le futur, c'est que le réseau devienne, auprès de Statistique Canada, une espèce de champion, de rappel que l'esprit qui a présidé à la création du réseau puisse accroître la capacité d'écoute par rapport aux acteurs autochtones et à leurs besoins, eux qui sont les mieux placés pour comprendre, pour agir et pour améliorer leurs conditions. Et je souhaite aussi, comme on l'a dit précédemment, que les données puissent corriger un peu certaines erreurs qui ont été effectuées dans le passé, à partir de 2011 notamment, lorsqu'on a modifié en profondeur les procédures et parfois même le contenu des sondages, c'est-à-dire du recensement et de l'enquête. Merci.
Merci, Gérard, pour vos commentaires. It's so important to highlight the living conditions up north, and very interesting to hear about your work of across countries, just not within Canada as well. the work of highlighting the socio-economic gap between the Indigenous communities and neighboring non-Indigenous communities really does highlight the differences and highlights the conditions and the measures of poverty. So thank you very much for your commentary today. And now I'd like to introduce to you Jonathan Dewar, the CEO of the First Nations Information Governance Center. Jonathan is descended from Huron-Wendat, French and Scottish Canadian grandparents. He has spent most of his 20-plus year career directing research and knowledge translation initiatives on behalf of Indigenous governed national NGOs, and has been recognized as a leader in healing and reconciliation in Indigenous health, as well as well-being education, policy, and research. Jonathan received a doctorate from the School of Indigenous and Canadian Studies at Carleton University and holds an appointment as adjunct research professor in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology. Welcome, Jonathan.
Okay, well, thank you, Tim, and hello, everyone, virtually at this time. As Tim said, my name is Jonathan Dewar, and I'm the CEO at the First Nations Information Governance Center. I know that some of you have seen us present before within this network, and we're very pleased to join you again. For those of you who are familiar with the First Nations Information Governance Center, you will hear me repeat some of the things you probably heard before, but we've also done a lot of really exciting work over the last 3 years, which is how I'd like to end this presentation. So without further ado, I will share my screen and begin a short presentation. And I will just point out that I have more slides, more words on the slides than I will actually be turning to. I will paraphrase what you see in the slides. Those slides are really there for you, the audience, and happy to come back to them should we have any questions. So as I said, my name is Jonathan, and I've been with the organization for just 3 years now. But of course, we have been doing this work for many, many years, and that's part of the story that I'll tell very briefly. I'll start first and foremost by acknowledging the legacy of unethical research and information gathering that I think we are all familiar with. This legacy is something that we are very actively working to undo and repair, and certainly ensure we are not perpetuating as we go forward. There are many things that we can do as a network of researchers, as a community of practice, and generally for those of us working in any way with First Nations. And first and foremost, that's embracing the notion of First Nations data sovereignty. It's important to note that I here am focusing on First Nations. That's obviously my day job with the First Nations Information Governance Center. Our Inuit and Métis colleagues have their own way of talking about their information and their approach to ensuring that it is done the way they see fit. So I'll let them speak to that. You may also be familiar with a broader term called Indigenous data sovereignty, and that has its place, certainly in international contexts, and when we do need to speak about the collective interests of Indigenous peoples in a space, or as I said, internationally. But I'm very much focused on First Nations data sovereignty, as you would expect. And so very briefly, First Nations data sovereignty is the inherent right to exercise authority over First Nations data information. You'll see why this is important, especially in the last 3 years. First, I'll give you the brief history of our organization. So I think many of you know that the work we do is rooted in the mid-1990s, the work to develop what is now known as the Regional Health Survey and the OCAP principles. So in the mid-1990s, when First Nations were left out of some important population survey work, First Nations leadership, formal leadership, and the thought leadership of the day turned that challenge into an opportunity, which was the development of a by First Nations, for First Nations, national region-by-region health survey, which I've just referenced. Along that same course was the development of the OCAP principles. So how do we set principles to ensure that we are doing this by First Nations, for First Nations work ethically? 10 years ago, we were stood up as a standalone organization. That's the FNIGC I represent today. We're guided by principles, research ethics, and a cultural framework. And it's important to note that we are a tool wielded by First Nations through the governance of our organization. And so nations come together within regions via regional processes, and then our regional partners come together to do this national work that FNIGC leads. In the last 3 years, our board has developed a new vision, and you can see that First Nations data sovereignty is embedded in the vision. It's also embedded in our mission. An important distinction to make here, that when we refer to data sovereignty, we refer to it in the context of nations and their distinct respective worldviews. So this is about ensuring that we have approaches that respect those distinct worldviews to reflect the diversity across and within First Nations in Canada. Our core strategic objectives have also been set in the last 3 years to support the new vision and mission. I won't linger on them. If we were to give you the elevator pitch on what FNIGC does, it's certainly our national surveys, the RHS that I've mentioned, the FNREs, which ended in 2016, the follow-up social survey, which was in the field when the COVID-19 restrictions hit in March, and we are working with our regional partners to continue. That's the First Nations Labor and Employment Development Survey. We also have the directive to conduct research that aligns with the strategic direction and establish principles and priorities. We also importantly do research on data sovereignty and information governance, as you might expect. And then a big focus of what we do is also education, training, and capacity development. So we do work in the area of data sovereignty, of information governance and management, of course, the OCAP principles, and the data governance strategy, which is where I'm going to end the presentation in a moment. So what is OCAP? I think many of you will know that OCAP stands for ownership, control, access, and possession. And in the short amount of time I had to speak with you in this recorded session, I would just remind people of the very important distinction between OCAP at the level of principles, and we, FNIGC, as the steward of the OCAP principles, work at that level of principles. We do education and training to ensure that people have the information they need to be able to understand OCAP and work with First Nations in the furtherance of ownership, control, access, and possession. But it is rights-holding First Nations that determine, define, and ultimately implement what it means to exercise ownership, control, access, and possession. And again, I look forward to questions and comments as we get to the discussion part of this, if anyone feels that that was simply too brief. How do we do education and training? Well, one key way, of course, is we deliver a online Fundamentals of OCAP course, and the information is here, and it can be accessed via our website. I want to end with this notion of the First Nations data governance strategy. In the federal budget 2018, FNIGC received funds to design a data governance strategy, a national data governance strategy, and to coordinate the establishment of regional information governance centers. So on our website, you can find the full report that we submitted on March 31st of this year to Indigenous Services Canada. And it captures not just the report on the work that we did, but also the strategic framework, or the strategy as we refer to it. And you'll note in this graphic here, which is probably too much information for you to see in this short amount of time, but I'm happy to speak about it in greater detail. You can see we have a set of thematic principles, and within each of those thematic areas, there are several principles that are further outlined. And then we have what we call the 9 pillars for the strategy. 2 horizontal cross-cutting pillars, and then 7, again, thematic areas that we cover in the data governance strategy. Now, why is this important? Well, this is important because First Nations leadership has given the direction over many years that they want to see nations served by regional focused information governance centers, or we might say statistical institutions that can work at that nation level and that region level. And then the strategy articulates how these institutions that need to be built can continue to come together to do the work that we do at the national level, work that is best done or necessarily done at a national level. So this is very much a central element of the data governance strategy. And again, there's a link on this slide, or you can go to fnigc.ca to find the full report and the strategy that we articulate in greater detail. I'm looking forward to having conversation with people, particularly if you remember past presentations, about how this strategy will work to enable the work you may be doing with First Nations. It really is strategic from a number of focuses, First Nations needs, obviously, but also is meant to be seen, like OCAP, as the best tool for those of you working in research spaces, whether government, academic, or other, to do the best work possible in collaboration with First Nations. So again, FNIGC is a tool wielded by nations and our partners in that sense. So with that, I say thank you. I look forward to hearing the other panelists and to having conversation with you when we get a chance.
Thank you, Jonathan, for those insightful comments and forcing us to think about how to do ethical research with regarding to First Nations and, of course, Inuit and Métis data. We all have that onus upon us to make sure we do the best job possible, and it makes me think of that adage, nothing about us without us. This concludes the pre-recorded portion of the Spotlight on Indigenous Issues. We invite you to please stand by as we transition to the live question and answer session with our panelists. If you have yet to do so, please submit your questions now, and we'll try and get to as many as we can. The live Q&A is starting now.
Hi, panelists. That was great to see all of the presentations, and I enjoyed our hearing that, and I hope the participants enjoyed it as well. I do have several questions for you, and I hope I can get through a lot of them because there's a few of them that have really come through. And I just want to remind the participants that you can send in your questions by using the hashtag CRDCN20 as well. So you can get that through us right away, and we can try and get it to the panel as soon as possible. I'm going to try and go through, ask some general questions, and each of you some specific questions. And so I'm going to start with Donna, because you are our lead panelist. And so I have a question here for you in terms of, given the inherent policy relevance and the importance of your work, how have you built the relationships with the appropriate federal and provincial governments? And what efforts do you think that the CRDCN could further bolster that?
Thank you. So I think there's a few answers to that question. So first, I know, Tim, you and I do know each other, and I've tried to share my work with Indigenous Services Canada whenever the opportunity arose, and I've emailed and included them in conferences, and your researchers in conferences that I've hosted, or I should at least say one conference that I've hosted. And one thing that I think the RDC and provincial governments, I think that when there is work that is most relevant at a provincial level, I think it makes sense to do the same thing that I've done with Indigenous services with them. I've also tried to make my research more accessible to community members by talking to people on the ground and reaching out to local First Nations here when there's work that's relevant. So the other answer, I think it'd be really useful to offer some relationship building on the part of CRDCN, just some extra support, since many academics don't have those relationships that are unclear who to reach out to, and cold calling to government officials is not always the most productive. I have tried that before, just general email spamming, and it is not the most useful. So I think that's how I could use it, just in terms of who's the right person to connect to, but that would require capacity on the part of the RDCs to be able to do that, to know who the appropriate contacts would be.
It definitely depends on the networks that we develop and how those relationships we establish, for sure. And taking advantage of those opportunities to share that research to policy so that they can incorporate it into the decision-making processes. So yeah, absolutely, I agree. There was a question that came in when Simona, when you were doing your presentation, I thought I'd address it directly to you. And it's dealing about Indigenous populations specifically. And the question came in that's saying, dealing with home dynamics, and I hope I articulate this properly, do Indigenous men and women, are there confounding factors that affect Indigenous men and women differently in the home dynamic? I think I'm articulating that correctly.
I am not sure I understand fully what home dynamics means. So I can speak about living arrangements and maybe the way that Indigenous households are organized. In in my research, I treat households as units. So I try to, and then I look at certain characteristics of individuals in these households to try exactly to move away from these very Western-centered perspective that looks at nuclear families, Western families, where the individual is the main focus of attention. And I try rather to look at the household as a unit, and I try to look at who are all the different individuals that are living in these households. So I'm not sure, I am not sure that I can speak to this idea of the individual dynamics in the households.
Okay, well,
I
there might be a question, a follow-up question, so maybe we'll come back to that, Simone, if it comes back for clarification. Gerard, there's a question that came up in terms of when working with self-reported Indigenous data, are there any caveats that should be made when working with such data, especially in terms of the stability of one's identity, in terms of how it may change over time?
Gerard, vous êtes sur mute.
Yeah, we can hear you now, Gerard.
Yep, thank you. Sorry. Yeah, I was saying that there are difficulties. So that was an example. Yes, several difficulties in terms of comparisons over times, for instance, because there are moves, changes in the kind of answers, and also in the tags of these variables. And when you go back to old census, then you'll see that the questions about Aboriginal identities are somewhat different, and it is not easy to make comparisons. The other point is that the lack of data when it comes to small communities in terms of number of people, and then it can have some impact on the result when you try to compare from one census to the other, for instance. Well, these are kind of difficulties that you may experience when trying to work with that.
Excellent. Yeah, it's always very important to be aware, especially in terms of how the data comes in and the data source in terms of how you interpret that information. So thank you very much, Gerard. Jonathan, we do have a couple of questions for you, and I'll kind of go to you, and then I'll open it up to the floor afterwards. But there's a couple of pinpointed questions, and that when we're looking at data collection specifically with First Nations, should we automatically be including FNIGC? Is that should be just a best practice? Is there something? Is there in terms of respecting OCAP principles, etc.?
Yeah, that's a great question, Tim. I've unmuted, so I'm hoping you can hear me. Yeah, it's a great question. So, I mean, FNIGC is not a rights-holding organization. So, of course, Canada's relationship is with First Nations in the context of nation-to-nation relationships. And if that sounds complicated, it is. It's necessarily complex in order to do these nation-to-nation relationships well. That has to be the focus for all of us. So it's my focus running a First Nations organization, and it needs to be the Crown's focus, whether it's an agency with independence like a Statistics Canada, or departments and agencies across the Crown family. That simply has to be the focus. Capacity has to be built up to enable that. Now, where an FNIGC has been mandated or directed to work in a specific lane, then yes, if you are working in a space that we share, it makes sense for FNIGC to be there. If you've sent me an invitation to sit on something, you know that our response is always to first ascertain if the role that we would play as an FNIGC is strictly apolitical and strictly technical. And if there's a need for that advocacy focus, we look, of course, to partners like the Assembly of First Nations or our regional partners, some of which are very much apolitical and technical, some of which overlap into big P, small p political context. So yes, if you need a relationship, if you need help forging relationships, which was an important part of Donna's comments earlier, FNIGC is here. When I said that we are a tool for First Nations and we're also a tool for those working with First Nations, that's what we're here for. We're expecting our phone, or whatever the right 2020 terminology is today, we're expecting our phone to ring. And then again, subject to capacity, we look to fill those gaps and make sure that partners working with First Nations, partners looking to work for First Nations in the future, have the information that they need, have the tools that they need, so that we can forge ahead with the best approach for First Nations. OCAP's not meant to be a barrier. What we're proposing in the strategy is not meant to be a barrier. It's meant to create the optimal environment for First Nations to do the best with their information that they can. They won't come up with all their own ideas. They're going to need the best partnerships. And so where researchers sometimes drive those conversations, we absolutely know from experience that it can be done well, it can be done ethically, and it can be done to serve the needs of First Nations, and at the same time be rewarding to those researchers in those relationships. So we're here, but we will be very clear about what is sort of a bedrock necessity of doing work with First Nations. So again, nation-to-nation relationship, and then quickly move to the technical considerations of being in relationship, in business with First Nations on whatever front we're talking about.
So, one of the interesting things, Jonathan, is that, we're talking here about the RDC, and a lot of people here may have worked with the data from the RDC. And of course, when you try to access the data from the RDC, there's the limitation that there's some information that's not included from First Nations communities themselves, because simply that data wasn't collected from the community themselves. And so I wonder if there's a way that you could speak to people possibly accessing information from FNIGC. How would they access and go through that route?
Yeah, so I mean, I'll start with an important point that maybe many people in the audience have heard me say before in other presentations I've given, right? So when we talk about building up First Nations institution to do this work, and Indigenous Services Canada, my colleagues there, that department was stood up with a mandate to devolve, and so programs and services are meant to be delivered by First Nations institutions, and there will be, of course, information components of those institutions, but then there also needs to be these separate, independent, credible, apolitical, statistical institutions that can do work like a Statistics Canada can do across many fronts. So what you may have heard me say before, but is absolutely bears repeating, is building up First Nations institutions doesn't mean tearing down Canadian institutions. Again, it is about creating that optimal environment where the best tools are available and can be used by First Nations and used within partnerships, within relationships amongst First Nations and perhaps non-First Nations partners. That's a big reason why FNIGC was stood up. It's why the RHS started back in the day, why we exist as a standalone organization. We are the stewards of the national level data that's collected from those national surveys that I talked about. We have a data center. And so that data can be accessed, but it has to be accessed in a very particular way. So if you go to our website, you'll see that there's a portal there. And maybe I'll just plug the fact that in the next few weeks, we'll have a brand new website with a much better portal. But as it currently exists, there is a portal there for those interested in accessing that national level data that we are the stewards of. It must be done through a very prescribed process of application. And so the portal itself has been vetted by experts within our network, and how we determine what questions are asked and the evaluation of how those questions are answered is also determined by a process that was developed in partnership with our 10 regional partners across the country. So there is a way to access it. It's not a free-for-all by any means. The data centers in other contexts are not either. So this shouldn't take anyone by surprise. But in this case, this is a process that has been developed by First Nations for First Nations. That being said, again, we're not here to put up barriers. We're here to ensure that the best work can be done for the benefit of First Nations. And so you'll see, if you've been through that process, or perhaps if you take this opportunity to learn more and go through that portal yourself, for future projects, you'll see precisely what I mean by how it can be accessed and the limitations that necessarily have to be placed on that.
Thank you. I just want to open up the floor to Donna, Simona, and Gerard with this question. Feel free to jump in if you feel like you have an answer. And then the question is, like, when talking about our university students, what kind of skill sets do they need in order to work with Indigenous data? And what advice do you have for them in terms of building partnerships with Indigenous people on their research? Yep. Go ahead, Simona, and then Gerard.
I didn't want to cut Gerard off. I think that there is indeed a big education gap, I think, right now in the skill set that we teach at the university level for data analysis, specifically to Indigenous students. And so I just wanted to mention that the Department of Demography at the University of Montreal, we have just launched this year a new undergraduate program, a new major in demography that will include a mandatory course on Indigenous demography, and that is meant to help initiate university students, especially in the Indigenous students who are taking courses at the university about, among other things, issues related to data collection and analysis, specifically with respect to issues related to Indigenous demography.
Thanks, Simona. Gerard?
Yes, I won't talk about the technical skills because it is something that we more or less know well how to fix. The main problem I see with the younger generation of students is their lack of knowledge and understanding of the reality on the ground. My first advice would be go and meet people, talk to people, experience the life there, and listen, and that way you'll have another glaze when it's time to analyze the data. I had several students who wanted to do good science, and they locked themselves into the CRDC, the 6, as I mentioned it, but without an experience, without the knowledge of, you know, the real people and the real life, the real day-to-day life, and connection with leaders, community leaders. It's well, not useless, of course, because you can do very good research playing with numbers only, but when you have an understanding, not only through statistics, of course, not only through literature, but also through the experience and listening to the people, what they have to say, how they see lives, how they will interpret the data. If you ask the question, then you'll have another kind of answer. So this is what I see as the main problem in training the young researcher.
Okay, thank you. Donna, do you have a comment?
I guess I would also just want to compliment what has already been said by the other panelists. I do think that on the ground understanding is really important to do good work because it allows you to see with clearer eyes what the data might be saying or telling you. But I also think gaining a broader perspective, so first, of course, obvious statistical skills and supporting our students, building them up, that's something that all universities are want to do and achieve, and at least in the programs that we're in. But also having students read a lot of contextual literature and background in addition to just having that on-the-ground experience, because giving context, data without context is dangerous. So supporting our students in doing some of the necessary contextual readings would also be an additional thing I think we can do to support our students.
Donna, you talked about longitudinal survey work in your presentation. There was a question that came forward about you know, in such studies like on aging and health, there's always this remark about trying to ensure maximum retention. But of course, there's, you know, many people are excluded if they were in an institution, living in a First Nation reserve or in a settlement area. What steps should be put forward to try and make that maximum exclusion of everybody in the longitudinal survey? You're on mute.
I'm sorry, can you repeat the maximum exclusion?
So trying to ensure maximum retention and follow-up in a longitudinal survey. You know, many people are excluded, right?
Yes.
From such surveys. And so what do you think could be done to try and include people in those situations if they're from a First Nations community or a settlement or living, if they're in an institution at the time? What efforts could be made put forward? And a tough question. Yeah.
It's a tough question, partially because I don't have experience working in a statistical institute, right? So I can't say what are the main barriers to, there might be many barriers that I'm unaware of in terms of collection in institutions, et cetera. But in terms of retention, so first of all, we'd have to work with the First Nations Information Governance Center, obviously, if we're going to be working with First Nations communities, to include them. So there's got to be a way to deal with this in a way that allows us to cross reservation boundaries, because people do as well, right? So I think that maximum retention requires the participants, first of all, believing that there's a social benefit or a benefit they see from participation, right? So having the trust of the participants and earning their trust is really essential, and also communicating clearly what the social benefits would be for them and their communities, I think is another step. And that's a challenge, right? Yeah. So, but again, I am not equipped in terms of my background to really fully give a great answer to that question.
It's okay to throw you a curveball. Jonathan, we're running close to 2 o'clock, but I really wanted to save this one question here for you that came through. And the question is, what are your thoughts on OCAP and how it can be applied to the data that resides in the RDCs? Specifically, you know, mostly StatCan data.
Yeah, so I mean, this is the million-dollar question, you know, for this network that we're talking about. So, you know, in the spirit of that comment that I made earlier about building up First Nations institutions does not mean tearing down Canadian institutions. This is a problem that we do have to resolve. You know, so Statistics Canada has its role, and that role is going to continue. I mean, we have a world-leading statistical agency that has done, there are many wonderful stories that Indigenous communities tell about work that they've done with Statistics Canada, or with the information that has been collected from Statistics Canada, whether it's the census or the APS or what have you. But what we need to do within this network is to start to build, and if it has to be incremental, then we start building incrementally. So the questions to be asked are, you know, is there formal Indigenous representation in decision-making? Is there formal Indigenous representation in, you know, committee structures and evaluation structures and that sort of thing? Ultimately, what we are looking to do is, wherever possible, develop by First Nations for First Nations approaches. We're seeing our Inuit colleagues, you know, very strenuously promote that approach as well, right? So Inuit-specific, Inuit-distinct approaches to things. And again, I won't speak on behalf of Inuit or the Métis Nation, but that's what we're seeing. And so this idea of developing, you know, the appropriate governance structures where we can assure that First Nations are involved in the decision-making, whether that's at a community level, a nation level, an aggregate level, which can include a national level. Those are the questions we have to work to. Statistics Canada, in developing you know, a new Center for Indigenous Statistics and Partnership, has taken an important and significant incremental step towards ensuring that there's a dedicated focus for those kinds of activities. We get approached for this kind of thing quite a bit. We have often had to ask there to be a refocus when we're asked to sit on, say, a governance body over Indigenous data that has been collected by a non-First Nations entity. The answer typically to date has had to be, no, we can't do that because of course, you know, the role that we have been given as a national organization. But we can work collectively to study the issue, determine the feasibility of what's currently underway and what is possible, so that we can begin to move forward and take additional steps forward. So there's a lot of things we have to do at the working level, and then ultimately at the decision-making level. So with me and my national board and our partners across the country, and then within Statistics Canada, whether it's via that still relatively new center, or all the way up the chain of command at Statistics Canada, we're in the same game. We're in the game of building up First Nations institutions, making concrete the necessary relationships that have to exist institution to institution. So that is very much our focus. We're not the OCAP police. First Nations themselves, rights-holding First Nations, determine issues of ownership, control, access, and possession. So if you're not already working at the ground level with communities, and the governance structure with communities, at the nation level, where there is a governance structure there, or at the aggregate level, then absolutely that work has to be significantly advanced so that we can get to the point of discussing what is not just theoretically possible, but what are the practical opportunities, and then ultimately what's practicable? What can we actually achieve?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Just for the participants, we are going to go past a few minutes past 2 o'clock. If you have to leave us, I apologize, but I think we do have a bit of time. There's several more questions I'd like to try and get through. So just hang on with us for 10 more minutes if you can, and we'll try and get through it all. I'd like to point and towards Gerard and Simona in terms of what do you feel in terms of Jonathan's comments that he just made in terms of what can the universities do to take a step closer towards following OCAP principles in using the RDC data? Just to flip it on the other side. Gerard?
Yes, well, I think one answer to that is one thing we can do, given that the data is there, it is to have questions asked by our partners in the First Nations. And that way we will, well, once we have the questions, we can work in a meaningful way to try to find answers. And all the way along these adventure of trying to understand better or trying to answer questions, we have to work in close relations with our partners, not only to, to comment on the answer or what was the typical way to do that before comments on the paper, the final results, but having a real partnership working together all the way from the questions to the results. And it includes the analysis plan, the kind of variable we will use, and etc. So this is the closer you are with partners, the more relevant you can do a job.
Thank you. Simona?
I think that we need to teach students about OCAP. I think that they don't necessarily know what OCAP is, or indeed how it can be, how it can be implemented in practice in research. And it's that should not be about Indigenous people, but it should be for Indigenous people. And I actually wonder if the RDC network could not collaborate with university partners, maybe to have, especially nowadays that we do everything remotely, maybe to develop short capsules that could be on the RDC websites that would be easy for the students or the researchers that want to know more about, how about to adopt OCAP principles in the research. I find that the OCAP principles are detailed in numerous ways, but I think maybe to make them more accessible to students and researchers who are just starting out to do research in general and need to understand and need to be taught about what the principle of this research is. And I know we're a little bit over time, but I have done for most of my career research in Africa, and I knew very well, like I was taught very early on, what is it that you need to do to have ethics, to have an ethical approach to research that is done in these settings. And I think that you know, it is part of research ethics to teach students about OCAP and about these principles.
Mm-hmm. Donna, there's a question that came through that I'd like to throw at you in terms of a distinctions-based approach to data and data analysis. And how do you balance the value of being able to aggregate data to compare Indigenous to non-Indigenous? So the balance of grouping it, doing the comparison at the higher level, Indigenous, non-Indigenous, but in terms of also having the importance of having the distinctions-based analysis.
For sure. Well, I mean, so in terms of, so how I'm interpreting the question is they're asking how does one find the correct balance between aggregation and comparison and allowing for difference, right? Yes. And that's a challenging question that I think relies partly on the question you're asking, right? So what is the question we're asking? And then how much data do we have, right? So many of the data sources that we have may have some samples that don't allow for us to think about heterogeneity in, say, the program impacts for particular First Nations, right? I do think being able to go beyond mean comparisons when thinking about comparisons between First Nations or Métis or Inuit communities and non-Inuit communities is a useful way to go. So you're still getting aggregation, but we're not just thinking at the level of the mean, we're thinking about still dispersion within communities themselves. But of course, obviously, in some sense, data is essentially about aggregation, right? And what you can do and what you're able to do depends on the data that you have, the question you're asking. But I would encourage researchers generally to try to go beyond mean comparisons with the opportunity to. And also, if they have the data to do so, to be able to allow for heterogeneity in responses of different communities and nations.
It really depends on your data source in terms of how you're able to work with that data, the story that you're able to tell, right?
Exactly.
And then, I think if you can do First Nations compared to non-First Nations, that's also a fair comparison if the data allows you to do so. So it's really about being able to respect the storyline, I think, in terms of each of those distinct identity groups, and then being able to talk about gaps overall. Yeah.
And again, thinking about just mean differences is sometimes always obscuring some of the really, again, just in terms of just raw mean comparisons, particularly with the types of data that exist around allowing us to compare non-First Nations to First Nations, it often leads to deficit narratives, which, again, it's important to point out when society is failing and when there are not the same socioeconomic opportunities for certain groups because of historical and modern reasons. But at the same time, trying to go beyond the mean allows for more nuanced and important stories to emerge as well, I think.
So I have one kind of a general question. There's a couple of questions that have come in about COVID. I'm trying to articulate it in a way, but I think it really comes down to, there's certain challenges that COVID have been put across for all types of data collection, but is COVID affecting our ability to do data collection and report on the results? And maybe we can go back to Jonathan from FNIGC.
Yeah, well, we had a national survey in the field when the COVID restrictions hit. And given that we work at the direction of our regional partners in this national survey work, we had to turn to them and say, okay, where are we collectively and where are the regions individually or, sub-regional community level perspectives. And that work on the First Nations Labor and Employment Development Survey came to a full stop. And we had to build in this assessment period and really an analysis of what we could do to carry a national survey to conclusion when some of our regions were quite advanced in data collection and others were just ramping up as COVID hit. So we've had to work our unique model in a way that we've never had to work it before. And I don't want to speak to the definitively yet. You'll see it. You'll see us report on it in the next several months as we come to a conclusion and we report out on it. Our other national survey, the Regional Health Survey, is ramping up, and in fact, we're talking with Statistics Canada about what are the best practices to do work in community in this COVID environment. And StatsCan has to figure this out with the census. We have to figure it out with the RHS. There's a lot of us that need to talk and compare notes. Ultimately, for us, it's meant having to more fully explore, technology that will allow us to be in the field, quote unquote, be in the field to do this research. Typically, our approach would be much more community-based, a human being talking to a human being. Really, that's the best First Nations practice. How do we do that when a First Nation is on lockdown, but still wants to benefit from information gathering activities? It's a big conundrum, but fortunately the partners are still able at this point to put some focus on that, while of course putting significant focus on the immediate needs to address the catastrophe that is COVID-19.
Simona, you have a comment?
Comment. So I am part of the network for the social impacts of COVID-19, and last week or 2 weeks ago at our last meeting, we were presented with some general practices that are being studied for the census. And I actually thought that the current state of development is actually created an opportunity, if anything, to change a little bit the way that the census is done in communities. Because from what I understood, one of the ideas that is being studied is actually to rely much more on local employment and local quote unquote canvasser, right? The canvassing method that General Statistics Canada uses in communities is not gonna look like at all like it normally looks like, because there is gonna be much more of involvement of local community members in this process and local hiring, which I thought was it's actually a good development of the census in this context.
Yeah, absolutely. This is a huge challenge coming forth with the 2021 census taking place in May. I got my fingers crossed, but I have my doubts too. So I really hope that established practices will prevail and be able to get the data. Gerard, I have one last question. I'm going to point it towards you. And the question is, access and the use of data on Indigenous issues depends on establishing trust, relationships, and what advice and guidance can you provide in this regard for others today?
Well, the answer could be very long, but in a nutshell, I would say the idea is to really build up a trust between the researcher and your partners, and to share, not to push for, doing your things, or trying to, get, for instance, the support from the community to justify a research program you want to put in the making. The idea is to share knowledge, but really through discussions, for instance, about what are the main concerns or priorities of the people you have in front of you. What can you contribute to that in order to get answers or to suggest some way of doing something about it? And that way, of course, when you are a university researcher, you have your own constraints, but you have to live with that if you want to do science and good science, to work towards a more just society and a more equal society. Then you have to listen to what the people have to say, what worries they have, what questions they have, and try to make that your priority, and to work, as I mentioned earlier, really hand in hand to develop a research design, for instance, and to come with answers, and at the end of the road to come with policy recommendations to change things for the betterment of the people.
Thank you so much for everyone's contribution today. Your time and energy put towards making this panel discussion pertinent, relevant, really excites me. It really, the discussion has been kind of broad, but so good to kind of hit home. We have excellent participation with 70 participants from around the world today, so it's lovely to have everyone's involvement in this. I just want to put a brief reminder out there in the chat. There was an earlier link to a call for proposals with the Aboriginal People Survey at the RDC. The deadline is October 31st. If there's researchers out there that would like to submit, possibly get some grant money for their work. So please take that into consideration. So I bid everyone farewell, and hopefully we'll get together on a similar conference discussion at some point in the future. Take care, everyone.